Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books in Bytes. Today we're undertaking a deep dive into a really powerful book, H. John McMaster's Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. It's based on some incredible research, including documents that were classified for a long time. And McMaster really challenges this idea that America just sort of inevitably slid deeper and deeper into Vietnam.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
His core argument really is that this major escalation, particularly between, say, late 63 and the summer of 65, it wasn't some unavoidable historical force. It came down to specific choices, specific failures, right at the top.
Human failures, as he puts it.
Exactly. Uniquely human failures. So today we want to unpack that. Look at how Johnson, McNamara, the Joint Chiefs, how they handled or maybe mishandled Vietnam. And we'll definitely get into those lies in the subtitle, the ones that, well, pave the road deeper into the conflict.
Absolutely. We'll basically follow the timeline McMaster lays out. We'll dig into the flawed decisions, the communication breakdowns, sometimes even outright deception that marked this whole period. So maybe we should start towards the end of the Kennedy years, set the stage for Johnson.
Okay, yeah. It's useful to remember how Kennedy changed things up in national security. He thought Eisenhower's NSC, the National Security Council, was just too big, too slow.
A bit unwieldy.
Right. He wanted something leaner. Now, that's not necessarily bad, aiming for efficiency, but it did kind of change how military advice got to the president.
And didn't Kennedy also have some initial reservations about the Joint Chiefs?
He did, yeah. Things like defense reform debates,
Yeah.
and then early crises.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bay of Pigs, Laos.
That made him a bit wary. He wasn't sure their advice always matched what he saw as the new challenges. He was looking for more adaptable responses,
Beyond just massive military intervention. Exactly. Which is why appointing Maxwell Taylor as chairman of the JCS was so key. The idea was Taylor could kind of bridge that gap, align the military more with Kennedy's goal of flexible response.
Having a range of options, not just the all-or-nothing approach.
Right. And building on those shifts, another really major figure emerges, Robert McNamara. His background was totally different. Statistical analysis, Ford Motor Company.
The whiz kid. And this is where things get really interesting, dynamics-wise. McNamara comes in as defense secretary, brings this heavy emphasis on quantitative analysis, numbers, data, managing the military almost like a business.
His team, the whiz kids, they embodied that. And while, efficiency sounds good, this really rubbed the Joint Chiefs the wrong way.
You can imagine decades of military experience suddenly feeling, undervalued compared to spreadsheets.
It created real tension, these new management techniques, plus maybe a perception that these civilian analysts were a bit dismissive. The JCS started seeing McNamara's office less as a partner and more like, an adversary questioning everything they knew.
But wasn't Taylor initially okay with McNamara?
Initially, yes. Taylor saw the value in tackling some of the departmental inefficiencies. But as McNamara's power grew and these quantitative methods became dominant, the other chiefs got more and more frustrated. They felt sidelined.
Okay, so that's the backdrop. Tensions in civil-military relations. How does this play into the early days of Vietnam involvement? What was the thinking then?
Well, the big picture was still containment, right? Stop communism. And the view was very much this monolithic Soviet-led threat. Southeast Asia was a key front. And South Vietnam, unfortunately, became a sort of test bed for counterinsurgency ideas.
So more advisors start going in.
A lot more. And initially, there was this optimism, maybe too much optimism, but things like the Strategic Hamlet program, trying to separate villagers from the Viet Cong.
But McMaster shows that didn't last, right? The positive reports kept coming, but the reality on the ground was getting worse.
Exactly. Which brings us to a really critical point. The coup against Ngo Dinh Diem.
Ah, yes. The relationship with Diem had gotten really strained.
Extremely. And the signals from the Kennedy administration about a possible coup, they were very mixed, very ambiguous. It's a classic example of how unclear messages from Washington can cause chaos on the ground.
And Taylor and the JCS actually warned against it, didn't they? Said removing Diem would hurt the war effort.
They did, strongly. They worried, quite rightly, it would just cause more instability, weaken the South Vietnamese government when it was already fragile. Even people like McConey at the CIA, Robert Kennedy, they were cautious too.
Shows a real disconnect, potentially, between political desires and the military assessment of what might happen.
But despite those warnings, the coup happened. And the way Diem and his brother Nhu were killed, brutally, that shocked everyone, even in Washington.
A grim reminder that you can't always control these things once they start.
Absolutely. Kennedy was clearly disturbed by the violence, but his response afterwards was basically to call for unity, get everyone behind the existing policy, trying to project stability after the fact.
And then, of course, the Kennedy assassination changes everything. Lyndon Johnson is president.
Right. And Johnson's immediate focus, his passion, was his domestic agenda, the Great Society.
Vietnam wasn't his top priority initially.
Not in the same way. And he deeply admired McNamara, saw him as brilliant, indispensable. That relationship becomes absolutely central to Vietnam policy.
So the Joint Chiefs, seeing a new president, they ask for guidance.
They do. They want direction, confirmation of the strategy.
And Johnson. McMaster paints him as someone drawn to things that boost his popularity, right? And he had this, well, complicated history with the military.
But ultimately, McNamara's skill with numbers, his ability to present data persuasively, kept him firmly in Johnson's confidence. He remained the dominant voice on Vietnam.
Which carries its own risks, doesn't it? Too much influence in one place.
Definitely. And it leads us to this really fundamental split in strategic thinking. McNamara's idea of graduated pressure versus what the Joint Chiefs wanted, which was much more decisive action.
Can you break that down? Graduated pressure sounds careful.
It was influenced by the Cuban Missile Crisis, or at least McNamara's interpretation of it. The idea wasn't really to win militarily in the traditional sense. It was about using limited force as a form of communication. Slowly increase the pain on North Vietnam to persuade them to stop supporting the Viet Cong. It was about signaling diplomacy through bombing, essentially.
Which must have driven the military commanders crazy.
Fundamentally. The JCS believed you needed decisive action. Remove the restrictions, apply overwhelming force, achieve clear military goals, win. General Greene, for instance, felt increasingly strongly. Either commit fully to win or get out. It's that classic tension, civilian focus on political signals, military focus on battlefield results.
McMaster points to a JCS memo in early '64 that really spells out this difference, right?
Yes, it laid bare the disagreement. But Johnson, he really wanted to avoid a big, difficult decision on Vietnam before the '64 election.
Politics driving policy.
Absolutely. And Maxwell Taylor, as chairman, played a key role in kind of deflecting the JCS push for stronger action, keeping things simmering but not boiling over before November.
And then the Gulf of Tonkin, August '64, a hugely controversial moment.
Hugely. The circumstances around those alleged attacks on U.S. ships, they're murky, to say the least.
McMaster's research suggests the first incident probably happened, but the second one?
Highly questionable. It may well have never occurred, which raises serious questions about what Congress and the public were told. It really shows how ambiguous intel, if it fits a political need, can be used to justify major steps.
And Johnson and McNamara jumped on it.
Immediately. Portrayed it as clear, unprovoked aggression. Used it to justify retaliatory strikes and, crucially, to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through Congress.
Which gave Johnson enormous power to act in Southeast Asia.
A virtual blank check. Passed almost unanimously. It massively boosted Johnson's standing as a strong leader right before the election.
Even though, as McMaster points out, there were doubts within the military about that second attack at the time.
There were. But those doubts got pushed aside. The political momentum was too strong.
So, after Tonkin, the resolution is passed. What happens next? Does the debate inside the administration change?
The debate continues, maybe even intensifies. The JCS, feeling vindicated perhaps, push even harder for sustained pressure against North Vietnam.
But the election is still looming.
Exactly. So William Bundy, Assistant Secretary of State, comes up with this idea of a holding strategy. Basically, don't rock the boat, minimize risks until after November. Keep things steady.
Purely political timing.
Pretty much. But the chiefs, even with their own internal disagreements, felt the stakes were too high just to tread water. The situation in the South could collapse. They started pushing back more forcefully against just waiting.
What about Taylor? Did he still want to hold back?
His position seems to have shifted a bit. Initially, he seemed to think maybe some action against the North couldn't wait. But ultimately, he fell in line with the election year priorities, which frustrated the other chiefs even more.
So the election really dictated policy throughout '64.
Overwhelmingly. Johnson's strategy was minimal overt action. Don't look weak, but don't escalate dramatically either. It was a tightrope walk for political gain.
Keep the covert stuff going, plan some small South Vietnamese actions, but no big U.S. moves.
Right. And McMaster suggests McNamara was key in managing perceptions here. Apparently, he downplayed to Johnson how much the JCS really wanted bigger airstrikes. making it seem like they were mostly okay with Bundy's cautious plan.
Interesting. More evidence of McNamara filtering information or shaping the narrative.
It seems that way. Then McMaster discusses the Sigma II Second War Game in September '64. What did that show?
It was pretty worrying, actually, and maybe prophetic. It directly challenged the whole graduated pressure idea.
How so?
The simulations basically predicted that this slow, incremental approach wouldn't work. It wouldn't force North Vietnam's hand. Instead, it would likely lead to a long, drawn-out, costly war for the U.S., needing way more troops.
A stark warning. Was it listened to?
Largely ignored, it seems. And around the same time, you had voices like George Ball, Undersecretary of State, arguing internally for disengagement, the devil's advocate position, as McMaster calls it.
But that option, just getting out, it wasn't really on the table, was it?
Not seriously. The momentum, the mindset within Johnson's inner circle seemed fixed on staying involved, somehow managing it, at least until the election was won.
Which brings us to the Viet Cong attack on Bien Hoa Airfield. November '64, American casualties, planes destroyed. That must have tested the holding strategy.
It did. Johnson had hinted an attack like that would bring retaliation, but when it happened, they decided against it.
Why?
Yeah.
Still the election fallout.
Domestic politics, yeah. Maintaining that image of restraint, even after the votes were cast but before things settle, seemed more important than a military response.
It must have frustrated the advocates for stronger action even more.
You'd think so. But George Bundy, the national security advisor, actually asked Taylor in Saigon, okay, what can we do to show resolve, boost morale down there, but without starting a bigger fight? They were still trying to thread that needle.
So this leads to the Bundy Committee, right? Tasked with developing options.
Yes, but here's the catch. They were told to develop options based on gradual pressure. That was the framework.
So the outcome was kind of preordained.
It seems that way. The JCS, again, found themselves dissenting from this forced consensus, feeling the options were just too limited.
Then McMaster points out a really revealing comment from John McNaughton at Defense.
Yeah, McNaughton's view, quite cynically, was that the real stakes weren't even about South Vietnam itself anymore. It was about containing communism globally, yes, but maybe even more about America's international prestige. Credibility.
That's a significant shift in rationale. Less about helping an ally, more about geopolitical image.
And it led to them even considering accepting less than a fully independent South Vietnam, as long as U.S. credibility wasn't damaged too badly. A lowering of the bar, really.
Wow. So McNamara then formally asked the JCS to plan for controlled and increasingly severe military pressure. How did they react this time?
They drew up the plans, as ordered, but they were deeply skeptical. They argued this limited approach wouldn't secure South Vietnam. It would only signal resolve, maybe punish the North a bit, but it wouldn't achieve victory.
Then Ambassador Taylor proposes his own idea, the pulmotor treatment. What was that? And what was his view on ground trips?
Taylor's pulmotor idea was a two-phase escalation. Phase 1, more covert ops, airstrikes in Laos, retaliatory bombing of the North. Phase 2, maybe, more systematic bombing of North Vietnam.
But still no U.S. ground combat troops.
He was strongly against it, vehemently opposed.
Why? What were his main concerns?
Several things. He feared it would look like the French coming back, undermining the South Vietnamese government's legitimacy. He worried U.S. troops would take over the fighting, weakening the South Vietnamese army's own efforts.
And the quagmire potential.
Exactly. He foresaw getting sucked into a long, costly occupation, a ground war the U.S. wasn't prepared for.
Yet, despite Taylor's air power ideas, things kept getting worse in the South through late '64, early '65. Johnson, though, sticks to his line. Another attack, and we hit back.
Yeah, which sets the stage for finally sending in ground combat units. How did that happen when Taylor was so opposed?
It's interesting. Figures like McNaughton and George Bundy, even though they doubted military force alone could win, started seeing ground troops as, well, an attractive option. Why? To signal resolve, to protect that reputation.
Credibility again.
Credibility again. And McNamara, incredibly, was still downplaying potential U.S. casualties, even saying publicly there'd be no need for combat troops, while internally planning for bombing reprisals was already happening.
And Johnson backed him up.
Reinforced the message. Said maybe more U.S. personnel were needed, but kept it vague. Then Pleiko happens, February '65. Viet Cong attacked the U.S. base, American soldiers killed.
And that was the trigger they used. It provided the immediate justification for retaliatory airstrikes, Operation Flaming Dart.
Finally hitting back.
Yes, but those initial strikes were pretty limited, and the results weren't great. Didn't achieve much militarily.
Which led to
Operation Rolling Thunder. The sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam begins. But even then, McMaster emphasizes, it wasn't the all-out campaign the JCS wanted.
Still restricted.
Heavily. McNamara kept incredibly tight control over targets, constantly overruling the military's recommendations for hitting more significant targets. Caused immense frustration, confusion, a feeling of fighting with one hand tied behind their back.
And while the air war ramps up, General Westmoreland starts asking for ground troops, right?
Yeah.
To protect the air bases.
Urgently. He argued they were essential just to secure the bases being used for Rolling Thunder. And
Yeah.
Taylor, did he finally give in?
Reluctantly. He agreed to a limited deployment of Marines to Da Nang, strictly for base security. But even then, you had George Ball still warning, this is the path to a massive ground war, don't do it.
His warnings seem prescient now.
They do. Then General Harold Johnson goes to Saigon, March 65. President Johnson tells him to get things bubbling.
Get things bubbling. Doesn't sound like purely defensive measures.
No. Discussions definitely turn towards more assertive actions, potentially offensive ground operations. The JCS, even working within this graduated pressure mess, kept pushing for a more resolute approach, fewer restrictions.
Then the Honolulu Conference in April 65, what did that reveal?
It really exposed the gap between Washington and the commanders on the ground. McNamara seemed to want to shift focus to the war in the South and kind of downgrade the air war against the North.
A fundamental disagreement on objectives.
Absolutely. McNamara, Bundy, they seem to be aiming for limited goals, preserving credibility. The JCS still wanted to secure an independent South Vietnam, two different wars almost.
And then, strangely, the Dominican Republic crisis gets tangled up with Vietnam.
Yeah, the administration used the Dominican intervention to build support for more funding, framing both situations as fighting communism. Made it politically easier to get money for Vietnam without as much scrutiny. Clever politics, maybe. There was also that brief bombing pause, Mayflower, in May 65.
Mostly for show. Public relations make it look like they were trying for peace, even as the real plan was further escalation, not a serious negotiation effort at that point.
And Westmoreland keeps asking for more troops. Wants to go on the offensive.
Yes, his requests become much larger, much more urgent. He sees the South Vietnamese potentially collapsing without a massive U.S. intervention. He wants to take the fight to the enemy, a clear shift from defense to offense. But Johnson was reluctant to admit that publicly.
Very reluctant. Didn't want to reveal the full extent of the changing mission.
So we get to the summer of 65, the July decisions. This is the point of no return.
It really feels like it. McNamara recommends sending many more battalions. Not quite as many as Westmoreland wanted, but still a huge increase.
Johnson himself expressed worries about getting in too deep.
He did. Voiced anxiety about it getting harder to get out. But ultimately, they approved the deployment of the 1st Cavalry Division, a major offensive unit. That was it. The U.S. was committed to a large-scale ground war.
And throughout all this escalation, Johnson was trying to hide the true cost.
Desperately. He worried a big, expensive war would kill his Great Society programs. So no formal war declaration, no calling up the reserves, try to keep the budget impact quiet.
McNamara helped with that, downplaying the costs.
Yes. And the JCS, despite their own likely misgivings about fighting a war without full national mobilization, had their concerns largely suppressed or ignored.
So wrapping this up, looking back at that period ending July 65, what's the core message from McMaster?
The central thesis is that Johnson's focus on his short-term political goals, his personality, the flawed advice system he relied on. It added up to a dereliction of duty. McMaster argues powerfully that the disaster wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific human failures. Bad strategy, terrible communication, deception.
And by July 65, with the big troop deployments approved and the strategy still stuck on graduated pressure, the U.S. had basically crossed the Rubicon, headed for that long, costly war.
Yeah, to sum it up, those early Vietnam decisions, they were just this toxic mix. Political calculations, flawed ideas about the war and the enemy, really dysfunctional relationships between the key players. It just led deeper and deeper in, without a clear goal or a real strategy for actually winning.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. How often does the chase for short-term political wins end up creating huge, unintended, long-term disasters in foreign policy or military affairs? What lessons are there here from this really tragic time about needing clear goals, needing honest communication between leaders and advisors, and constantly critically questioning your own assumptions when you face a crisis?
Heavy questions. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.